to talk about pre-irrigation and planting dates. And of course, as we start managing limited water, those become two important considerations as we look at setting ourselves up for success moving into the growing season. So of course, as we consider just over the last several years, why we have seen pre-irrigation become even more important, we know that in many situations, we are moving into the season in extremely dry conditions. I was listening to a weather report for the Southern Great Plains yesterday, and 2025 was officially the warmest December on record. And while there were definitely some cold blasts that came in, overall, the average across the month was warmer than average. So warmer than average, dry conditions, windy conditions, as you all know, and that is really creating some very dry fields moving into this cropping season. So these variable drought conditions, reduced water supplies, we cannot meet the demand with our in-season well capacities. And so we have to better manage the soil moving into the season, and pre-irrigation helps us create that savings, really build up those profiles, but then also a lot of flexibility. Sadly, we are tied to crop insurance challenges with regards to planting dates. I know that crop insurance is, or RMA I should say, is seriously considering some revisions to planting dates to provide flexibility, but then that becomes a situation where you have to really carefully manage other agronomic considerations. First and foremost though, this is the time of year when we see everyone start to kick on those pivots. And historically, we knew this was a very inefficient use of the water, but then again, we are building up those soil moisture reserves. And if we don't have the winter and spring precipitation, we really do have to fill those soil moisture profiles. And so when we think about this though, we have to very carefully manage how we are storing this, because we also want to ensure that we optimize precipitation efficiency if we do receive rainfall later in the season. This picture on the left, I think, is very common what we see, especially where we have intensive forage production and compaction. We have pre-irrigation and ponding of water. And when we look at the infiltration rates, the hydraulic conductivity of our clay loam soils, and we consider that we have less than 1/4 of an inch per hour infiltration rates, we know that we have, especially following a 1-inch irrigation pass, we have water that is potentially sitting on the surface for 3 or more hours. And on a very warm and windy day, there's the potential to lose a lot of that water. So that's the efficiency of these pre-irrigation events that are so important. But nevertheless, we need them. So when we consider the benefit of pre-irrigation, it's really when we have a dry soil moisture profile. We have soils that do have high water holding capacities. Pre-irrigation is not efficient in our sandy soils. We get into those, whether it's the western portion of the panhandle or even some of the northeastern blow stands down on the southwestern panhandle, where we don't have the ability to hold the water. It's not an efficient use of the water. It is also probably a greatest benefit when we do not have the irrigation capacity to meet our in-season crop water demand. If we can meet our crop water demand with in-season irrigation, there's no reason to, in my opinion, apply pre-irrigation that has a reduced efficiency and going to be an inefficient use of a very precious water supply. So when we have a low benefit of pre-irrigation, that is when we have soil profiles that are already wet at the time of irrigation, or again, those soils with very low water holding capacities. And then a flexible planting date. Depending on what we are growing, if we have flexibility with those planting dates, we can possibly shift our planting dates to coincide with precipitation. That's one of the benefits that sorghum provides us. We have a very broad planting window. We know that we can successfully plant a grain sorghum or even a forage sorghum crop into late June, depending on the maturity class of the hybrid, and still do well with that. It's when we start considering our corn hybrids that we might not have as much flexibility, but then again, it depends on the hybrid, the maturity, and what the end use with that is. So, we've known about the inefficiency for years. Here is a statement from Jack Music and Freddie Lamb. Freddie Lamb was a phenomenal irrigation engineer with Kansas State. And he states, the irrigation capacity sufficient to meet crop ET pre-plant irrigation is not the most efficient use of the water. So that's something to keep in mind. How are you managing your water? How do you have systems tied together? And then, as I previously mentioned, heavy rainfall after irrigating will either run off or it sits on the surface of ponds and it evaporates. If you already have a full soil moisture profile, that cup is full. You are not going to be able to put any more water in it unless it's drainage or evaporating. And again, drainage is an inefficient use of water. When we push water below our root zone, it is not going to be efficient. So in addition to increasing soil moisture for peak water demand periods, there are some other benefits to pre-irrigation though. We definitely can improve crop establishment. It provides us a great opportunity to really evaluate a system, look at the uniformity of the system, check the nozzling and the pressure, and really make sure the systems are operating as they should and efficiently. Also provides an opportunity for field preparation, especially activating those residual herbicides. So coinciding pre-irrigation with timely pre-plant herbicide applications can be very beneficial. And of course, this is dependent on the solubility of the herbicide, but nevertheless a great way to activate those herbicides. Now back to those disadvantages of pre-plant irrigation, because there's always pros and cons to this strategy. As I previously mentioned, it reduces the efficiency of irrigation in pre-season precipitation. And this figure over here on the right, while an older figure, it actually looks at the difference in storage and the increasing the stored soil moisture between a non-irrigated field and a previously irrigated field, along with pre-season rainfall, and then the soil water holding capacity on the y-axis. So if we have a field that was not irrigated, we can improve and increase the amount of the volume of water that is stored in that field at a greater fraction than we can a field that we have previously irrigated. And of course that increases with the amount of rainfall, or decreases, I should say, the inefficiency of that system. So this really just highlights, again, we have to, as we're managing our pre-season irrigation, ensure you are leaving enough soil storage so that you can capitalize on timely rainfall if it is received. Also, one of the disadvantages, especially in our cotton crops, is that pre-irrigation can lower soil moisture for earlier planting dates.
Jordan, you cut out.
And the conservation component of managing our water. Are we protecting our investment with residue? And that is something that is very important. So this figure actually looks at a series of irrigation and evaporation sequences from the bare soil surface. I actually collected this data when I was at USDA, and what we did was measure the amount of evaporation, or to quantify the evaporation losses following several irrigation events in early June on a bare soil surface before planting. And so coming in, we had soil that was very dry. We're looking at a water content that would be approaching permanent wilting point. Irrigated, allowed that soil to stabilize. There was an evaporation sequence. We measured again another irrigation and then another irrigation. These two mid-irrigation events equated to about 1.5 inches of irrigation. And then followed the evaporation sequence over a series of 4 days. Now, one of the things when you look at this sequence, you see there's the drop and then there's the stabilization. A drop and a stabilization, that stair-step decline. And those are the daytime and nighttime sequences. During the day, we're drying off. During the nighttime, when the soil's cool and the sun is gone, we stabilize, and we don't have any losses, and then so on. So what we did show with that early June evaporation sequence is that following those 1.5 inch irrigation events, we lost about 0.3 of an inch of moisture per day. Now this was from a very warm, hot, and dry period. And what we do know is that just when we consider peak water demand, that we can be exceeding over 0.3 of an inch. What fraction of that is actually tied up in evaporation? Crop water use, when we are measuring it, it's a combination of evaporation and transpiration. Because not only are we providing water for the plant, we're providing water to meet that environmental demand. And this is what that environmental demand can reach on a very hot, warm, windy, early June, in June in the growing season. So really what this highlights is that in order to increase stored soil moisture by at least 1 inch, we need at least 2 inches. And that's because we are losing so much of that water to evaporation. And so as we consider, if you are pre-irrigating and you're putting on, say, 6 inches of water just to increase.
Paige, you might have to get off your internet.
Not only irrigation allocation that's for that season, but also think about the pumping costs and the economic associated with that because of the lost water. And so as we consider that, how are we protecting that pre-irrigation? You could easily be just throwing $50 to $60 or more per acre out the window because of lost water that has evaporated. So this really goes back to the value of residue. In the last session, we talked about cover crops and how important cover crops were, but then also stepping back and just considering in our environment, managing those residues are extremely important. And this really highlights, again, why residue management is important. Yes, cover crops that are terminated can provide us that residue. They can protect crops from wind and protect the soil from evaporative losses, but managing the residue from the preceding crop, is definitely a strategy that we know is very efficient. So if we do pre-irrigate, how should we manage this? First and foremost, we should target a soil moisture that should be no more than 75% of the soil's field capacity. And that will then allow us to have some room in the profile if it does rain. We want to make sure that, again, we have the ability to utilize that additional rainfall. And also then if we consider, okay, we want to ensure that we have no more than 75, or we have reached no more than 75% of field capacity, how much water should we apply then? So these are stepping back and really thinking about each field on a field-by-field basis. What is the soil texture? What is your water holding capacity? And then what is the targeted depth of irrigation, and how is that going to affect your planting date? And we really do want to make sure that we are allowing for sufficient time for a field to dry down just enough for field activities. We do know that when we pre-irrigate, and if we have a wet field and then it rains, we can delay those planting activities. We can delay other activities in the field, and if we get in too early, we can cause some serious compaction issues. And it's not just compaction from the tractor, also compaction in the planting furrow because of field conditions. And so we want to make sure we're optimizing the value of that irrigation. So before we decide we're going to pre-irrigate, though, we also need to know how much water do we need. What crop are we growing? How much action? Now, when we talk about total crop water use, as we previously discussed, we're talking about the combination of precipitation, irrigation, and stored soil moisture. So for corn, if we're really looking at this, we are going to say we have about 24 to 30 inches of total water if we're really going to try and optimize yield. On average, we know that a corn crop needs about 10, can y'all hear me okay?
You keep cutting in
Yes,
and
I
out.
hope so. Okay. Okay. I just wanted to make sure, also before my screen was glitching, make sure y'all can hear me. Okay, so on average, for every inch of water, we can make about 10 bushels. So again, assuming you have 27 total inches of water, we then might be considering a 270 bushel corn crop. Now, that's very realistic. We do know that with improved efficiency, with residue management, as long as we're managing pests, we can increase that. Our research has shown that we can make up to 13 bushels per inch of water in a well-managed system. We also know that as we get into a very inefficient system that is poorly managed, we'll see that water use efficiency drop to 6 to 7 bushels per inch of water. So we really have to step back if we're looking at this and determine how efficient are we, or how efficient are we going to be with our agronomic management. Cotton, we're looking at about 12 to 24 inches of water on average. We're looking at about 50 pounds of lint per inch of total water. And so again, that is going to fluctuate. What we have seen in some of our research is that we can make up to 60 pounds per inch while we're optimizing our planting dates, early planting dates, residue management, optimized seeding rates, everything that we're looking for agronomically to optimize those yields. Likewise, in a very late planted crop that's poorly managed with a poor stand, we might only make 30 to 40 pounds of lint. And then grain sorghum, we have so much flexibility, I think, because of our planting window and just the ability to tiller and really take advantage of in-season conditions. And very similar to cotton, 12 to 24 inches of total water. So what percent of this crop water use is going to be our irrigation? And so we do have to step back and think about what is the duration of that peak water demand. Now we talk about peak water and we know that corn can approach 3/500ths of an inch during that tasseling period. We know that in some years where we have very hot, dry, windy conditions, we've even seen our peak ET reach 4/10 of an inch in the Texas High Plains during that tasseling window. But what's key is that for a corn crop, we're not just talking about tasseling, that 7 to 10 day window when we're really trying to mitigate that stress and ensure pollination. We're actually talking about a period from 12 weeks through blister, where we are over 3/10 of an inch per day. So on average, that's going to be a 60-day window where we are optimizing the water use and really ensuring that we are meeting that crop water demand. Now conversely, cotton actually can reach a pretty high crop water demand too if we're shooting for those high yields and really wanting to ensure that we don't drop blooms. We're looking at about 2/800ths of an inch per day as we reach, through that bloom period through our first open bulb. But when we look at the duration of that, a 1/4 of an inch to 2/800ths of an inch, it's about 40 days. So when you can shave off 20 days of a peak water demand in addition to 1/10 of an inch per day, you really have the flexibility to manage that water supply. So there are really important considerations that you have to make as you move into determining how much pre-irrigation, how much water do you need based off of the crop you are growing. And so then with that, what is our well capacity? How much capacity do we have to meet our peak water demand? So again, if we're really looking at a non-stress corn crop and we want to shoot for those high-end yields and we want to be able to reach 3/500ths of an inch per day or a 1 inch every 3 days, which would be fantastic if we had the capacity to do that, we'd be looking at irrigation capacity anywhere from 6 to 7 gallons per minute per acre. In reality, we are down here in this 3 to 4 gallon per minute per acre range where we have multiple wells tied together. And so with that, we know we are approaching anywhere from 5 to 7 days to apply an inch. And so how are we managing that strategically so that we can ensure timely irrigation? And so that's, or timely crop water use so we don't stress the crop. So this is then where we look at, okay, how are we going to pre-irrigate and why is it important? So this is older data from USDA ARS at Bushland, but nevertheless, the principle still applies today. So this was from 2010, and the reason why I have 2010 because it was actually a pretty average year. It was prior to the intense droughts of 11, 12, and 13. We had about 18 to 20 inches of rain that year, moderate temperatures, so it's a pretty average year. What we saw for peak ET at that research station was that we needed 6.3 gallons per minute per acre to reach that peak ET window during that. And so what we had though is we considered that 6.3 gallons per minute per acre. This is for a corn crop that was planted off. You know, we had to step back and realize, okay, do we have that capacity and how much water is needed to meet that? But if we don't have that capacity, we can actually make up for the difference in irrigation capacity with stored soil water. That's an additional 2 inches of water during that window. And so at that point, we could actually get by with 4.1 gallons per minute per acre, plus stored soil moisture will then help us get to that peak ET demand. Now, one of the things I don't have emphasized in this presentation, but I do know is extremely important, is that we have to have the rooting depth to get to that stored soil moisture. And what we often see is that we might start the season with good soil moisture. We take those pivots on early. We have a crop that is not encouraged to root deeper. And so we have very shallow rooted crops, in some cases 2 to 2.5 feet. And they're not utilizing soil moisture that might be at 3 to 3.5 feet. And so we want to make sure that when we are managing our pre-irrigation, we are not discouraging our crops also from rooting down to utilize that, because then it's just a waste of water. I think we've all seen that in hot, dry periods with years where we start out very favorable, cool, moderate, wet conditions, and the plant is going to be ready to eat. There's no reason for it to root deeper. And then all of a sudden we hit August and it's hot and dry and we don't have the rooting depth and the root volume to access that moisture. So this is a really good way though, managing your stored soil moisture appropriately, a really good way to get by with reduced well capacities. So this also, as I mentioned earlier, goes back to just the soil texture, infiltration, and our water holding capacity. And so what we do know is that as we consider our clay loam soils and we look at our clay loam soil, that we do have on average a field capacity that reaches about 0.33% or 33%. So what that would mean is that for every foot of soil, if at field capacity, 33% of that could potentially, 33% of that volume could potentially be filled with water, well then you could have 3 to 4 inches of water per foot. And that's where I personally like a push probe. And it's great to have the soil moisture sensors in the field, but to have a push probe and go out there and use it as a tool to validate what you are seeing with your soil moisture sensor is extremely meaningful. And we briefly talked about that, I know, in the last section as well. Just pushing down and how far can you push, and what does that tell you about the water holding capacity or the depth of the water and how much water is in that profile. So a really good tool for that. So as we consider that water though, we have, depending on our soil, 3 to 4 inches of water per foot of soil. Well, is that all going to be available? We have to sit back and realize that really, especially for a corn crop, we are looking at a managed allowable depletion of about 50%. So we have 4 inches of water in our profile per foot. We actually want to probably consider depleting it 50%, because we know when we get less than half of that available water use, we are now approaching wilting point. And even though if we get down to 30%, we're not going to necessarily start to see wilting, but we know that plant is still expending energy. It is having to pull water harder. And it's like trying to suck a milkshake through a straw. And so it's expending energy, and any energy that plant expends to extract water is going to be at the expense of crop production. So if we're really looking at a well-managed crop, we want to consider what is our managed allowable depletion. Now, sorghum has a lower managed allowable depletion because it actually has a lower limit for the wilting point. Research has shown that sorghum can actually extract water to a lower soil matrix potential, lower pressure within that soil than a corn crop can. So that's one of those very beneficial drought advantages that a sorghum crop has over a corn crop. So you can pull that soil moisture profile down a little less with a sorghum crop and provide some flexibility with that. So when we talk about soil water, we do know, as this previous slide indicated, that we're talking about a combination of different types of water. We have the hygroscopic water, which is that water that's held really tightly. It's going to be really impossible for a plant to extract. We have the capillary water, the water that's actually out between the pores, and that's what's plant available. And then there's the gravitational water. That is water that is just going to drain because of gravity. Now this figure, I think, is an extremely useful figure. It gives you a very good indication of how much water might be available based off of soil texture and water per foot that is,
Jordan, we've lost you.
Now?
There you are.
Right.
Kind
Okay,
of.
so it was just an extension of that figure and kind of gives you an indication of your soil texture, how much water is actually available. Not that, that total volumes, again, we have different fractions and not all of it's going to be available. So once we know soil texture and water holding capacity, how long is it actually going to take us to achieve 55% of field capacity with treated irrigation? So in order to know that, though, we also have to consider what is the rooting depth, what crop are we growing, and what is the rooting depth of the crop. And as I previously mentioned, we want to make sure we are encouraging our crops to root deep so that we can utilize that stored soil moisture. So corn 3.5 feet, sorghum 4 or 5 feet. Cotton's going to root down over 4 feet as well. Possibly, depending on how you're managing your field, you know that it'll even go deeper. I mean, we know maize in a dryland system can root up to 6 feet or more. So rooting depth is extremely important. So how long is it going to take us to fill up our field or reach a field capacity of 75%? Soil moisture that is 75% of the field capacity. So if we just, for the sake of simplicity, assume we are going to have maybe a corn crop, our rooting depth is going to be 3 feet, and then we know that our soil water at field capacity is going to be 1.5 inches per foot. So this is based off of our soil texture. We're going to say, okay, we are going to have, based off of our texture in the field, 1.5 inches of soil water per foot, and we're to target 75% of the field capacity. If we consider where our field capacity actually is before irrigation, so if you go out and push a probe in the field or you have soil moisture sensors, and you can estimate that, okay, your field is probably at 30% of field capacity, and knowing what your irrigation capacity potential is, say you have 3 gallons per minute per acre, and if you have 3 gallons per minute per acre, and it's going to take you about 1 week to apply 1.1 inches of water, assuming maybe 90% efficiency of that system, or I'm sorry, 80% efficiency of that system. Now, if you have close to 90% efficiency of that system, you're probably looking at about 6 days. So, the more efficient your system is, the quicker you're going to be able to get around and apply that. And so if we need to apply, we want to, well again, the water we need, we have a 3-foot rooting depth, and we know that we need 1.5 inches of water per foot. We need a total of 4.5 inches of water. So that's pretty straightforward. Okay, I need 4.5 inches of water. Takes me about a week to put on 1 inch. I need to irrigate for 4 to 5 weeks. Well, not necessarily, because then again, we have to consider what is the efficiency of that system. And we also have to consider that we only want to apply to 75% of field capacity. We don't want to fill that profile up because, again, the probability that it's going to rain is there. I mean, we might get some rain, and we want to make sure we're able to actually store that. So we need 4.5 inches of water, but we want to fill to 75% of field capacity, and we actually have a profile that already has, it's at 30%, well, then we actually only need 2 inches of water. However, if we're operating at 80% efficiency, we can take that into account. We actually need 2.5 inches of water. But if we actually assume that we're going to have, or we don't assume, we know we have a bare soil surface, and we know the inefficiency of that system and of water sitting on a bare soil surface, we can actually take that into account. We actually need 3.75 inches of water to increase our soil moisture profile to 75% of field capacity. And so, this kind of gives you an indication, and then of course, based off of 1.1 inches per week, well, it's going to take us about 3.4 weeks, 3.5 weeks, to apply 3.75 inches of water. So, when are we going to plant? If we're going to plant in early May, we want to make sure that we have enough time for field activities. Well, we probably are just a couple of weeks away from needing to get those pivots rolling to get that pre-irrigation on so that we have time to get in the field, get fields prepped, and be planting in early May. And so, of course, we can't discuss pre-irrigation without considering the role of tillage and residue management. Both are essential components of pre-irrigation, especially for low residue crops like silage and cotton. So this figure is one that I really do like to discuss because it shows the value of the residue. And I know that when we talk about cover crops, this is something that I highlighted, but really looking at increasing that stored soil moisture with the residue. And this goes back to just protecting the investment of your pre-irrigation. Now, I spoke to a farmer actually just last week, and he was telling me that he estimates on average $20 for every acre inch he applies. Well, if we're looking at the ability to save soil, if you're at $20 per inch, well, that's an additional $60 per acre. When we consider input costs, that's extremely beneficial. So, well, I think a very important way to look at the value of that. Of course, this residue, what research from Bushland did show is that before and after conservation tillage was implemented, they increased the value, increased the soil moisture by 170%. So that is an additional 3 inches of stored soil moisture because of residue. And so that's where, as we step back and think about managing and preserving on pre-irrigation, residue is very important. This is some other research that's actually looking at evaporation losses immediately following tillage. And this was some research that I was part of when I was with USDA ARS, and we actually conducted the same research at Bushland, Texas, and in Tribune, Kansas, looking at the first objective was considering just no-till sorghum yields in Kansas versus the Texas High Plains. And when we look at long-term data, no-till sorghum continually yields greater in southwest Kansas than it does in the Texas High Plains. Now, one of the things we see is that, of course, there is an environmental difference, and we do have greater wind speeds, but there is actually no difference in precipitation. So how is that environment driving that? But then there's also the function of soil moisture. And what we do see with our clay loam soils, while we do have a greater water holding capacity, we also have a greater rate of crusting than you would have in a silt loam soil. And so with that crusting, you have a bare soil surface and you have just enough rainfall or just enough irrigation from an irrigation event. You're going to get the crusting on that soil surface that's going to reduce the infiltration, increase your rate of runoff, increase your evaporative losses, and really reduce the efficiency of that pre-irrigation. So again, you need the residue to keep those soil temperatures cooler, to minimize the crusting, and improve the infiltration. This is actually looking at evaporative losses immediately following a tillage event. And so what we did see And the first, well, this was actually broken out into about the top 6 inches of soil. And what we saw is that the soil moisture following the tillage immediately decreased in the top 6 inches. And so that's really significant when you think about your seeding zone and the area where, especially early in the season, you're really trying to ensure stand establishment. And if you come in and till, well, you have immediately lost that soil moisture in that top 6 inches. However, what we did see is that with shallow tillage, there was no loss in soil moisture below 6 inches. So that's where if we step back and think about if we are tilling, even if it's strip till, what is the depth of that implement? How are we managing the speeds of the tillage and ensuring that we don't have variability and that we don't have losses of that deeper soil moisture, especially if we're pre-irrigating. We want to make sure we're preserving that investment. And so what we did discuss in that research were the different phases of evaporation that are actually in the soil, but the fact that also soil moisture and the evaporative phases are actually dictated by those soil pores. And a shallow tillage event can actually disrupt the capillary flow that connect to the evaporating process. And so you have your top soil and your lower soil, and by disrupting that, you can still preserve the soil moisture in that bottom zone. But again, it's really making sure that, we are staying in that top 4 to 6 inches so that we just disrupt the evaporation phase and we preserve the deeper soil moisture. And of course, this does vary by system and with implement. And this goes back to, and because of time, I'm actually not going to go into all this, but just different research that did discuss the fact that evaporation is not one-dimensional. It is regulated by the soil-plant atmosphere continuum and breaking that flow. So, summary of a poorly planned pre-irrigation, you're going to have runoff, high evaporative losses. To improve the efficiency of it, we want to maintain the residues and protect that and preserve the investment. Don't pre-irrigate until you know your soil moisture, your water holding capacity, and the current soil water content. Even if you're just using a push probe and don't have a soil moisture sensor in your field, probe that field and get an indication of how much water you have in the profile, and then also consider what is the potential rooting depth of the crop you are going to plant. And so this is some research. I know that I started just a hair. How much time do I have?
15 minutes.
Okay,
Or no more.
I think well, actually I'm halfway through. I'm gonna move to planting dates. Okay, very quickly, pre-irrigation and planting dates. So as we consider pre-irrigation, as I initially mentioned, we want to make sure that we have allowed enough time in the field for it to dry down so that we don't wind up with some compaction. This is actually a picture that I pulled off of the internet. However, several years ago, I received a call from a producer up by Gruber, and one of the questions he had was just about these variable plant heights in his field. And so as we started digging, this is exactly what we saw. We saw compaction of that planting furrow because he had planted into wet conditions. And so where there was sidewall compaction, the roots were just isolated still in that planting furrow, and those young roots were not penetrating down, and that was inhibiting the crop development. And so there was just that wavy pattern throughout the field. And it initially was very puzzling because, again, he had very wet conditions when he started, so a good profile. He had good irrigation. And it's like, why is there the variability out there? Well, it went back to just compaction and issues that were created by not allowing the field to dry down just enough so that pre-plant activities and planting activities did not cause problems. So planting dates. With corn, historically, we've looked at this mid-April through May. I think increasingly, and probably all of y'all are planting later than we historically did. We're looking at those May planting dates. Many producers, of course, are looking at even into June for planting. I do know that there's a lot of interest, especially from the South Plains, in even planting and having the flexibility to plant into mid-June without having a negative impact in crop insurance. And of course, as we step back and consider this, there's always the belief that the yield potential is less, but that really does depend. That goes into how are you managing the hybrid selection, and I do know with today's earlier maturing hybrids, they have the yield potential that historical earlier hybrids did not have. So we're talking about these relative maturity classes that are less than 110 days, maybe a 105-day hybrid. And so that's something that provides the flexibility for those later planting dates. One of the things that we have continually seen, though, is that it's very hard to find an earlier hybrid that's well positioned for the high plains that has the kernel integrity for very hot, dry conditions later in the season, so that you potentially don't set yourself up for issues in September if you don't have the kernel integrity. So that's a really important consideration when you start picking those earlier hybrids. So yield potential is not always less. Now, there is a reduced irrigation demand because we can shift the period of PPT to a more favorable period. So generally, August starts to get a little cooler. Hopefully, we pick up some of those monsoonal rains that are very beneficial in August, and we're shifting that tasseling out of the heat of July. It actually works extremely well for a split pivot scenario, and especially if we're pairing that with a water drought tolerant crop that does well with limited water. Now, cotton with planting dates, it actually has a very narrow planting window. We all know that we're really confined pretty much to May. For some years, we've actually done some extensive research looking at planting dates in cotton, and what we do see is that earlier is better. Out of 4 years of research, planting in early May versus late May yielded as much or more. And what's unique is that the as much as late May has been in situations where the early planting was damaged because of hail, wind, or saturated conditions. And so it's amazing how cotton does recover. The first year we had our early planted cotton, it had actually, quote, healed out, and I would have never thought twice if a farmer said, I'm replanting this. But because we had our second planting date, we left it. We came in and took it all the way to yield, and lo and behold, it yielded as much. And so it's one of those things, as we step back, we really have to consider, what is the condition on a field by field basis. And I don't think with the cost of inputs, even if you have a replant program with a seed company, how much is it still going to cost you to replant? So with cotton, we do want to make sure we either target or get irrigation late April. We want to make sure that we've allowed that time for the field to dry down, and if there is rainfall, we can still get in the field. Sorghum are very flexible. As I mentioned, depending on the hybrid, we've seen successful sorghum crops into early July. So cool temperatures in early May will slow down sorghum germination. I personally don't feel it's necessary to rush to get sorghum in the ground in early May, late May to early June, and again, depending on every scenario, there's the ability to push that even later. Now with wheat, pre-irrigation does increase total production. If we're in a forage system, having the ability to graze and to develop that forage is extremely important. But we also know from our wheat planting date research that wheat provides us a lot of flexibility. We can plant into November and slightly increase the seeding rate to compensate for less tillering, and that also helps us save a couple of inches of water, whether it's stored soil moisture or even irrigation in the fall, and we can improve the water use efficiency of those wheat systems. So we do have some flexibility there. So planting windows. So I showed you this figure earlier, especially as we look at corn. I specifically highlighted that May 3rd planting window and the value of the stored soil moisture in that. Oh, there is my time timer that I set. I'll just go over. Steve, tell me when you want me to stop. So
10 minutes.
what we see here though is going from a May 3rd planting window to a May 23rd planting window. And if we have the stored soil moisture, we can now go from a necessary well capacity of 4.1 gallons per minute to 3.8 gallons per minute. So that's extremely significant if we look at having to tie several wells together or we're managing limited irrigation. Just shifting that period of peak water demand saved us 0.3 of a gallon per minute per acre well capacity and allowed us to still achieve that same yield. Now, of course, sorghum provides us even greater flexibility. If we have a sorghum crop that's planted on June the 12th, we can get by with 2.8 gallons per minute per acre. Just the ability of having that deficit or drought tolerant crop allows us to very carefully manage those deficit irrigated systems. So heat stress in corn, I do think it's important that we always consider that heat stress and water stress are not necessarily the same thing. There's drought tolerant corn, and there's heat tolerant corn. And so we do have to make sure that we are managing the heat stress, and especially during those periods of silking when our silks are very susceptible to dehydration. Here comes heat stress. Temperatures greater than 95 and low relative humidity will desiccate exposed silks and reduce pollen production and viability. And this, of course, is day and nighttime heat. Cool nights allow the plant to recover, but this is where, as we consider shifting that planting window, if we can, shift it to where we even have just slightly cooler temperatures at night and in the morning during that pollination window, we can improve our kernel set. So plants will continue to actually respire at night. The warmer the nighttime temperature, the greater the nighttime respiration is going to be. And plants need energy to respire. So again, any energy that plant expends is going to be at the sake of yield. At night, the plant uses carbohydrates from starch and lipids that were made during the day for respiration rather than yield. Soil moisture is important for cooling that plant. And so humidity and water demand. High humidity reduces plant water demand, but it increases heat stress. Corn pollen is produced within the anther sacs in the anther. The tassel releases new fresh anthers every morning from the top down. Heat reduces pollen viability, both fertility and the quantity of the pollen. And high temperatures and humidity in the morning will reduce pollen, delay pollen shed. So this is something to consider as you manage your planting dates with limited water. How are you impacting this pollination window? And ultimately it will impact your kernel set. So kind of just going through corn anthers and silks. This is just kind of looking at a difference between years and heat. Here's several different scenarios and kind of just hypothetical scenarios for overlapping those peak water demand periods. This is actually considering split pivot corn with 2 planting dates, or maybe even 2 pivots that are sharing water, and how you can manage that water with planting 2 different planting dates. So if you had an early planted corn crop on May the 1st, you would be with a 115-day maturing hybrid, you would be silking around July the 16th and reaching physiological maturity about August the 20th. Your peak water use is going to be from June the 30th through July the 30th. Now, again, we're going to have water, but a really high water demand from mid-June all the way into mid-August as well. There's a 60-day window when we're going to be greater than 0.3 of an inch of water. But rather than planting 2 pivots with the exact same hybrid, the exact same maturity of a hybrid and same planting date, if we had the ability to plant one later, and use an earlier mature period for that second. So right here, we're looking at just about 4 days where there's going to be an overlap in that peak water demand window. And so that's really critical because as we consider that peak water demand 2 weeks before pollen shed and 2 weeks after, we are hopefully able to optimize the water use as well as minimize any losses in kernel set. Our PET is normally lower in August, as I mentioned. So we have quite a bit of research looking at planting dates, and that's something that's highlighted on, I believe that's slide 43 in your handouts. So here's a different scenario, even looking at later planted corn. Now, of course, when we look at June 20th corn from an insurance standpoint, we know that that's well outside of the coverage window. But nevertheless, with that, we are now totally missing the overlap in that peak water demand period. And that really provides a strategy for missing that. Now, of course, one of the challenges could be is that if we wound up with a cool August, and we've seen that, a cool August, and you have decreased kernel set, decreased test weights, well, what does that do to your yield? Several producers in the South Plains who I've worked with who started using these strategies because of very limited water have said that their contingency plan for that late corn is always corn silage. And even though we are looking at a year where there's an excessive amount of silage because of good conditions last year, we do know that there's probably still going to be always an opportunity for corn silage. So if they wind up with a cool fall and don't have the opportunity for kernel set, well, not only can they possibly skip a late irrigation, but they can just go ahead and take it to silage, and that becomes an opportunity for that later crop and really provide an opportunity to hopefully maximize the water use with both periods scenarios. Maturity, that's always a question. What happens with the maturity with those later planting dates? And one of the things that we do know based off of our research is that the corn maturity actually speeds up. And so even though I mentioned, we could move into a cool September and we might have decreased kernel set and decreased test weights, from a maturity standpoint, because we are actually planting in warmer days, we rarely talk about growing degree day accumulation in corn, but all of our crops do have a growing degree day requirement. Heat is necessary to drive all crop production. And so we know that corn is actually going to speed up. So this is actually looking at just the difference, for example, under different irrigation rates for several hybrids. Now these are hybrids, but the premise would still apply to new hybrids. So for example, here's Pioneer 9880 at what would be 75% ET, that's about 5 gallon per minute per acre well capacity. This is a 105-day relative maturity hybrid. And what we see here is that by planting, and this would be in mid-May of 2019, in 2020, with the difference, we see that just because of the year difference and the heat difference, now all of a sudden we're looking at 114 days. And so we really do see how years do change for that. But then if we plant even later, we see that, well, we're not necessarily delaying everything, we're just speeding that hybrid up. So here we are in 2020, 114 day with our early May, or with our May planting, so moving to a late June planting. Now all of a sudden we've shaved 9 days off of the maturity of that hybrid because the hybrid has sped up. We reach black layer 9 days faster with that later planting. So that's pretty consistent across both years. So here's considering that strategy, 2 crops, 2 planting dates, an opportunity to avoid the overlap in irrigation. Corn and cotton and sorghum really make a great as companion crops, with sorghum being the companion. So just some considerations for that. Oh, this is some of that cotton planting date work that I had mentioned briefly. A really big team. We looked at not only research at Bushland, but there was some research in Kansas as well. and just seeing what is the impact as we move farther north. So here's the timeline of events and different planting days, different weather events, that there was a hailstorm, a windstorm, waterlogged field, and different scenarios every year that did impact just the establishment of these fields. Now, one of the things that's really important to highlight is that part of our methodology was ensuring uniform stands. So we overplanted, and we actually would hand thin so that we had 25,000, 50,000, and 75,000 plants per acre. Did allow us to not have research that was confounded by variation in stand establishment. We had two different phytogen varieties, phytogen 205 and 332, just to take into account the impact of determinacy, a very early determinate variety versus a less determinate variety, which was the 332. Two different irrigation capacities, 2 gallon and 6 gallon, and of course 4 years. So really we were able to evaluate the impact of the interactions of the varieties and the planting dates on yield, but also what we really did see is the fiber development was driven by weather events in every year. Growing degree days, one of the things that we did see is that even with our later planted crop, we do not run into these growing degree day issues. And this was actually, I should probably back up and kind of give some background to this research. This was research that was funded by USDA. And one of the questions that we have had moving forward is, because of increased crop failures, is this region actually capable of producing good cotton? So of course what we showed is that yes, we can produce very good cotton. Even though we are historically a growing degree day limited region, because of modern genetics and modern cultivars, we are not limited, and we are actually more efficient, I believe, per growing degree day, just because of our favorable conditions, especially with cool morning temperatures that they don't see in other regions. So growing degree days, we were not limited in that. I'm not going to go through all this data specifically because of time. I'll just kind of jump right into a summary of this. What we did see, as I mentioned earlier, planting date 1 out yielded planting date 2, or yielded the same as planting date 2. Varieties alone were only different in 1 of 4 years. Now, I thought that was really different because as a agri-life agronomist, I've switched into a 100% extension role, but especially when I had a research appointment, we did a lot of variety trials. And of course, everybody who's planting, you're looking for the best variety for your system, the best hybrid for your system. And I thought, especially from cotton varieties, it was really interesting that the varieties alone, even with the determinacy, were only significant in 1 of those 4 years. Seeding rates alone were only significant in 2 of the 4 years. And I do think a lot of this is because of just cotton's ability to flex. Cotton really is very plastic. It can take advantage of good conditions. Of course, we know it will shed blooms and bolls under stress conditions. So it really has the ability to adapt to different scenarios. But irrigation was significant in 3 of the 4 years. And there was a planting date interaction only in 2024. So really, after all this 4 years of research, what we learned was that we need to plant early and do not overplant seed. I have visited with many producers who have tried to increase those seeding rates just to ensure stand establishment, and that, of course, I can understand, especially where we have variable field conditions and poor germination. But as a whole, we did not see a significant difference, and especially when we consider these seeding rates in all years, between, say, the 25 and the 75,000. On average, about 50,000 seeds per acre gave us a pretty uniform yield, but plant early after all that. So just quick summary, storage hold water is very important. We need to ensure that when we are pre-irrigating, we are doing so with the plan that we are ensuring stand establishment. And we're encouraging that rooting depth so that we can utilize the stored soil moisture at hot, dry periods in the season. At lower well capacities, we also may need to reduce our irrigated acreage, and that's something that is a whole other topic. So with that, I don't know if there's any time for questions.